Make staying up to date part of your daily rhythm with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Savor your morning coffee and catch up on the latest on the AJC app. Enrich your commute with our engaging podcasts on politics, sports, and culture. Whether at work or on the move, our timely newsletters bring you midday updates anytime, anywhere. And as your day winds down, dive deep into our captivating articles and videos. Subscribe now on AJC.com.
The Honda you want is here, so drive in the moment with the versatile CR-V or Accord, both named a Car and Driver 10 Best. And when you're driving a Honda, you're driving the brand named Kelley Blue Book's KBB.com Best Value Brand for 2023.
See dealer for financing details. Car and Driver, December 2023, based on 2023 brand image words from Kelley Blue Book. Visit KBB.com for more information.
Welcome to True Crime Garage. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, thanks for listening. I'm your host, Nick, and with me, as always, is a man who loves sandal season. Here is the captain.
Just don't mind my toe fungus. It's good to be seen and good to see you. Thanks for listening. Thanks for telling a friend.
This week, we are excited to be featuring Batsquatch by the good folks at Rogue Ales and Spirits. Batsquatch is a delicious, hazy India Pale Ale with a 6.7% ABV. For years, rumors have circled that deep in the woods on Mount St. Helens lives the fabled Batsquatch. While there are many tales of Batsquatch, they are all a bit hazy on the details, which makes the truth such a juicy mystery. This beer is dedicated to the legend. Garage grade, 5 out of 5 bottle caps, and let's toast and cheers some of our good garage friends. First up, we have a cheers to Raquel Hofdahl from Vancouver, Washington.
And a big We Like Your Jib goes out to Rachel in Highland Park, Illinois.
Next, we have a double-fisted cheers to the Hedinger twins from Madison, Wisconsin. And last but certainly not least, here is a big cheers to the late, great FBI agent Brent Frost, who is now in a better place. Agent Frost spent his life fighting for victims, and in one particular case, moved mountains to catch a killer and get justice for a young woman. Agent Brent Frost is a hero, and we pour a little out for him today. Cheers to Agent Frost and his family, and cheers to everyone who contributed to the Beer Fund.
Yeah, BWERUN Beer Ron. Would you like to hear us talk more about the case The Boys on the Tracks? Well, you can do so if you're signed up on Patreon or Apple subscription. And Colonel, that's enough of the biz.
All right, everybody, gather around, grab a chair, grab a beer. Let's talk some true crime.
Serial killer Robert Pickton, 6 counts of second-degree murder.
Serial killer.
26 women.
Serial killer.
Pig farm. Serial killer Robert Pickton.
Serial killer.
Our true crime story this week starts off with the missing women from the Low Track. One by one, the women vanished. One day they're on the street, struggling to eke out an existence despite obstacles confronting their daily lives, and then the next day, they are gone. At first, maybe it was 5 women, but then 5 became 10, and 10 became 20, and the cycle continued. New girls and women found themselves on the streets of the Low Track, and then they too vanished. The women continued to disappear into thin air, never to be seen again. As the years passed, 30 missing became 40. As it turns out, some of these women were taken by a monster, a serial killer. One so evil that he mangled and disposed of their bodies in unspeakable ways. This is True Crime Garage, and this is the case of Canada's most notorious serial killer.
Serial killer Robert Pickton, 6 counts of second-degree murder,
Serial killer.
26 women.
Serial killer.
Pig farm, pig farm.
Vancouver, Canada, a city on Canada's western coast surrounded by mountains, famous for its ethnically diverse population of over 600,000 people within the city limits and 2.5 million in the greater Vancouver area. Like most large cities, Vancouver has its seamy side. But one historic part of the city, the downtown east side, is known as being one of the worst inner-city environments in North America. This area, known as the Low Track, is the poorest neighborhood in all of Canada, and it is a hotbed of drugs and abuse, poverty, violence, mental illness, homelessness, and sex work. This including underage prostitution. About 8,000 people live in this forsaken neighborhood, and a large portion of the population of Low Track area is Aboriginal or First Nation Canadians. The area was described by missingpeople.net as follows. Quote, "No other slum or ghetto in the country matches the squalor of this 10-block urban wasteland, with its rundown hotels and pawn shops, stained and fractured sidewalks, gutters and alleyways littered with garbage, used condoms, and discarded hypodermic needles," end quote. The Low Track is Vancouver's equivalent of the infamous Skid Row. Drug gangs stake out their territory. Drug-addicted women sell their bodies to pay for drugs. And the neighborhood has the highest HIV infection rate in North America, with an estimate 25% of the population being infected. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Low Track is the so-called kiddie stroll, where child sex workers walk the streets prostituting themselves to whoever comes along. Again, according to missingpeople.net, a 1995 survey of downtown East Side's working girls revealed that 73% of them entered the sex trade as children, and the same percent were unwed mothers, averaging 3 children each. Of those, 90% had lost children to the state. Fewer than half knew where their children were. Sometime in the early 1990s, no one is really sure exactly when, but female sex workers and or drug-addicted women started disappearing from the Low Track. Of course, it is impossible to say when the first disappearance occurred or who was the first victim to vanish. This area was constantly seeing transient people coming in and out, dying of disease or drug overdoses, and living under the radar with no fixed addresses and sometimes evading law enforcement themselves. Of course, some women surely just moved away without leaving a forwarding address, died of natural or from drugs, but eventually around the mid-90s, people familiar with the Low Track began to notice that there was seemingly a discernible pattern of downtown East Side women disappearing without a trace. Specifically, in September of 1998, an Aboriginal group sent the Vancouver Police Department a list of victims allegedly murdered in downtown East Side, with a demand for a thorough investigation. Authorities examined the 40-person list and ruled out some, as some of the listed victims had died from disease or drugs, and others had left Vancouver and were found to be alive and elsewhere. But Vancouver PD Detective Dave Dixon drew up a smaller list of Low Track women who seemed to have simply vanished. Many of them had disappeared in 1997 and the summer of 1998. He came up with 17 names. Then Detective Dave Dixon inspired the VPD to create an investigative task force. The official search for Vancouver's missing women began.
So like you were saying, some of these individuals were found. So the question becomes, do we actually have a problem? So in July of 1998, they're going to open up an investigation to figure out, do we have a problem?
That's exactly right. And the person that's going to head up this investigation, her name is Lori Shenher. She's a Vancouver detective constable that had experience with the sex workers of the low track. Lori had worked the streets posing as a prostitute to catch and arrest Johns who canvassed the low track. She had seen the worst of it by this time, the violence and degradation these women were subjected to on a daily basis. She also was acutely aware that the Vancouver Police Department officers who were assigned to the rundown area were generally callous to the situations of the women they were supposed to protect, often ignoring their complaints as either deserved or simply collateral to their chosen lifestyles. But by late 1998, the situation could no longer be ignored. We already talked about Detective Dixon. Well, Dixon continued to update his list and reported that the list now contained the names of 35 missing women. Every one of these women was a sex worker or drug addict, and many were of indigenous descent. Keep in mind, this is a detective who has already sorted out the persons who died of natural causes or died from disease or drugs or moved out of the area. He's only putting people on this list that are truly missing. Detective Lori Shenher, no longer with the Vancouver Police Department, now goes by the name Lorimer Shenher, would later write a book about the years spent on the missing women investigation, and one of the assertions made in the book, called The Lonely Section of Hell, is that few in the VPD appear to take these missing women cases seriously. The low track was a non-priority area, and these women, considered to be the dregs of society, were just not important. But the citizens, the good citizens in the area, were convinced that there was a malevolent force at work, and they were scared. In December of 1995, a young drug-addicted sex worker named Sarah DeVeers wrote in her diary, quote, "Am I next? Is he watching me now? Stalking me like a predator and its prey, waiting for some perfect spot, time, or my stupid mistake? How does one choose a victim? Good question. If I knew that, I would never get snuffed." Sarah was reported missing in April of 1998, and her name became the 17th on the list of truly missing women. It's not clear when thoughts of a serial killer began to materialize. Detective Lori Shenher says now that at the time, VPD did not believe that one person was responsible for the disappearances of all of these women. The only common thread between the victims were that they were engaged in the sex trade and had drug dependencies. There did not seem to be any other similarities. And the Vancouver Police Department stated publicly that they did not believe a serial killer was responsible. But according to the BBC, despite the lack of any tangible evidence whatsoever, several officers within the Vancouver Police Department began to suspect that a serial killer was, in fact, at work. One of them was Detective Inspector Dr. Kim Rosmo, the first police officer in Canada to obtain a doctorate in criminology. Rosmo was the creator of geographic profiling technique designed to map unsolved crimes and highlight any pattern or criminal signature that might have gone overlooked by detectives assigned to individual cases. By mid-1998, Rosmo noticed that the number of missing women had started to grow to anonymous levels in 1996, 1997, and 1998. And he felt that the increases were statistically significant. He said, quote, "I thought the only explanation for this was a serial murder case," end quote. But when Rosmo took his findings to the officer in charge of the Major Crimes Division, he was told that because the women tended to live transient lives, it was more likely that they had just drifted away. Rosmo didn't buy this explanation. His experience was that although the women were drug users and poor, they still maintained strong ties to families, friends, and the community, and they did not typically just disappear.
But those are haunting statements from the sex worker when she is saying, questioning herself, is this individual looking at me? Are we being hunted? And I think what makes this even more, and I think what would make it even more frightening for these workers would be the idea that you don't know if you know this individual or not. Has this person been a John with you before, or is this a mysterious person that once you get in their car, you never return?
Whoever it is, if it's one person or multiple people, they are taking people that you know. These people, however you want to describe their lifestyles or their occupation, if you will, these are essentially their colleagues, people that they see day in and day out, night after night, and they're vanishing. And the problem here, though, for law enforcement, and as far as, law enforcement has things to be concerned with, victims in the community are their number one concern, or should be. But they also are concerned with things like budgets, resources, manpower, women power, that kind of thing. And so they have a lot of things that are incorporated in the business that they are running, of keeping the streets safe and keeping the community safe. So the problem for law enforcement will be, even though a couple detectives are pointing out, hey, this is a problem that we need to address.
And it also seems like a problem that's ramping up.
Yes. But for the higher ups, truly, no bodies meant no victims, and no victims meant no crimes. These women were unpredictable. The victims were unpredictable and rootless. It seems now, and there are many that will agree with this statement, in Canada, from the BBC and persons in law enforcement in the Vancouver area, that they simply believed that it wasn't worth dedicating resources to trying to find them or to figure out if there truly was someone or someone's killing these individuals. Because again, no bodies meant no victims meant no crime. We have other things and other problems to be concerned about. As we noted, as it seems, these women were considered to be very low priority by VPD, and they were hard to track because of their homelessness, addiction issues, and transient lifestyles. The most that VPD was willing to do was to offer up a reward for information on the missing women on the VPD's list, and provide a skeleton staff for a new missing persons review team established in May of 1999, and this was headed up by Lori Stenher. Rosmo was demoted, eventually resigned from the force after voicing his concerns about a possible serial killer. Despite detectives like Shenher and Rosmo, the missing women investigation remained underfunded, understaffed, and underprioritized. This remained the case even though Detective Dixon's list contained the names of 30 plus women who were never seen again. And that number, as the captain pointed out, kept growing. It wasn't just that the VPD wasn't committed to finding these women that impeded the investigation into the disappearances. There were often no specific dates for when these women went missing. Their pimps, fellow sex workers, and dealers refused to cooperate with police, making tracking the women almost impossible. There were no bodies, there was no evidence, and there was no indication even that foul play had occurred. All the detectives had was a list of names, establishing a pattern and a hunch, and yet the list continued to grow to over 40 women by the early 2000s. Women were taken at an alarming rate between 1997 and 2001, and no signs of them or their bodies were ever seen again.
And what an odd situation. It seems like you have half the police department where they're like, doesn't matter, who cares? And the other half going, hey, something's not right here, but I can't prove to the other side that something's not right. There's no body that I could point to say, look, we have somebody kidnapping these victims and killing them. So this is a very odd situation.
Well, and not only do you have this list of names that keeps growing of these missing women, but think about everything that's going on in this neighborhood, right? In this world, and the lives that are being led by the victims and the bad guys that are their dates, right? So within this group, you are going to have men that will victimize these women in other ways that don't lead to them being missing or murdered.
Right.
So when you look at this and you try to establish, is there a problem here? You have no bodies. You have no dates, specific dates for when a person goes missing. And then to top that off, you have all these Johns who a percentage of that population is victimizing these women in other ways. So now if there is a suspect, or you're looking for a suspect, you've got a giant group of people. That pool is too large. Even more frustrating to the police were the attacks by anonymous Johns who could not be identified, right? So you have Johns that you've identified and Johns that are unidentified who may have smacked a woman around, beat up a girl. On August 10th of 2001, Vancouver police announced their search for an unidentified rapist who attacked a 38-year-old victim outside of her low-track hotel a week earlier. During the attack, police spokesman said the man claimed responsibility for sexually assaulting and killing other women in the downtown East Side area. The victim had escaped by leaping from her rapist's car. She was able to offer a description to authorities, but they were unable to find him. He was just one of the many faceless men who visited the low-track area for drugs and anonymous sex. Detectives also looked extensively at known serial killers from other areas who could possibly be responsible for at least some of the missing women. They were particularly interested in Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer, who was responsible for the disappearance of 49 women with a similar victimology in Seattle. He was identified through DNA in 2001. The VPD discovered that he had visited Vancouver, but were unable to establish any connection between Ridgway and the missing low-track women. Authorities also took a hard look at Keith Hunter Jesperson. Jesperson, a long-haul trucker who traveled widely across North America and killed at least 8 female sex workers and transients he encountered while on the road. Jesperson was nicknamed the Happy Face Killer for the smiling cartoon signature on letters he sent to police and the media. At one point, he claimed to be responsible for 160 murders, describing his female victims as piles of garbage dumped on the roadside. Once again, however, no link could be found between Jesperson and the vanished low-track women, and the disappearances continued after the Happy Face Killer was put away. Police also considered Robert Yates, who was convicted in October of 2000 of killing 13 prostitutes around the Spokane, Washington area. He was also suspected of 2 more murders in the neighboring county, but Yates could not be placed in the city of Vancouver for any of the low-track disappearances.
So law enforcement had some suspects to look into, but they weren't local. But they did find a local guy that they thought was a decent suspect.
Yeah, looking closer to home, they were very suspicious of 47-year-old Ronald Richard McCauley, who had spent a decent amount of time in prison, about 17 years. This for a 1982 conviction. He was paroled in 1994. And so that lines up with the timeline that they are looking at here. He's out on the streets for the time in question. And he falls on their list because he had several sexual assaults for rape, beating up sex workers, and he was declared by the state a dangerous offender. Eventually, he does return to prison in the mid to late 90s, though. So he's one of these guys that he's only out for a period of time. He's on their list, one, because of his background, his previous crimes, but there were 4 women whose bodies actually were found, right? We're talking about a list of women whose bodies that were not found being the concern in trying to develop some type of investigation on that front. But in this case, as far as this suspect's concerned, he is in question for 4 women's bodies that were found near where he lived. In July of 1997, Vancouver police declared Macaulay a suspect in the 1995 disappearances of those 4 women, whose names were part of this list of missing low-track women. But again, bodies that were actually found.
Well, that's a difficult thing when you have a list that's growing. You have to start asking yourself, as law enforcement, is this one individual that's responsible for all these disappearances, or is it more than one?
Well, and that's going to be an issue that will never really fully resolve itself in this case. There's still good reason to have questions about this, even as everything sits today. They couldn't prove a case for murder against Macaulay in the disappearances of these 4 women. But what does take place as this investigation kind of drags on, another suspect emerged that drew in everyone's focus. In late 1998, Lori Schenher, the detective who was leading the early stage limited resource missing persons investigation, learned that the Crime Stoppers tip line had recently received a call with a tip. The tipster was William Hiscox, a 37-year-old widower who had turned to drugs and alcohol before finding a job at a place called P&B Salvage. This was a business owned by Robert Pickton, who was known to many as Willie. This business is owned by Robert Pickton, known as Willie, and his brother David Pickton, both who lived in Port Coquitlam. Hiscox's foster sister was dating Robert Pickton at some period, and that's how he gets the job. So in a follow-up call to this tipster, the tipster named Pickton as someone who could be responsible for all of the missing Vancouver women. This tip isn't saying, 1 or 2 of the women on your list. This guy that I'm calling about could be responsible for all of the missing Vancouver women. Hiscox described the Pickton brothers' pig farm as a creepy-looking place, which was patrolled by a vicious 600-pound bull. Every great romance story has a happily ever after. 2 people meet, fall in love, and end up together for the rest of their days. Nancy and Dan Brophy were one of those couples. Dan was a chef who taught at a Portland culinary school. Nancy was a romance writer who filled her novels with sexy fantasies, betrayals, and murder. When Dan ends up dead, details of his murder that could have been ripped right from the pages of Nancy's novels become clues, and Nancy becomes a main suspect. So, this isn't a romance story. It starts with a happily ever after, but it doesn't end with one. Was Nancy just researching her next novel, or was she planning a murder? This is a story about what happens when the lines blur between fiction and reality. Follow Happily Never After, Dan and Nancy, wherever you get your podcast. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. This year has gone so quickly. I had so many things on my list of goals to accomplish this year, and I'm still getting to a few of those items. When life goes so fast, it's important to take a moment to celebrate your wins and make adjustments for the rest of the year. Therapy can help you take stock of your progress and set achievable goals for the next 6 months. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Take a moment, visit BetterHelp.com/garage today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/garage.
right, we are back telling the story of pig vomit. Cheers to you all. Talk hands in the air.
According to this tipster, the Pickton brothers also ran a supposed charity that they had created, the Piggy Palace Good Time Society, which was in fact registered with the Canadian government in 1996 as a nonprofit society intended to, quote, organize, coordinate, manage, and operate special events, functions, dances, shows, and exhibitions on behalf of service organizations, sports organizations, and other worthy groups, end quote. Hiscox, the tipster, said the special events that took place at the Piggy Palace, which was really just a converted building on the hog farm, he's saying these special events were really just drunken and drug-fueled raves attended by hundreds of partiers, including members of the Hells Angels, and the entertainment that was provided, it was by downtown East Side sex workers that were brought in masse for these parties. Hiscox said that he had been told by a female friend that she had seen random women's handbags, identification cards, and bloody clothing at Pickton's farm. The source was a woman named Lisa Yields, who told Hiscox that Pickton was creepy and could be responsible for the missing women that the public and the media were talking about. Lisa Yields told Hiscox that Pickton had a bunch of syringes, even though he didn't use drugs, and that the items she had seen on his farm were, quote, his trophies.
But this is beyond bizarre. I mean, can you imagine you're working the streets and the next thing you know, you're on this creepy farm going into the Piggy Palace. This is just beyond bizarre.
Unfortunately, this has happened in multiple cities around the world and more commonplace than any of us would like to think. And I've talked about this before, and it's the God's honest truth. Drugs are fueling for some of these persons that end up there for this party or the raves. Drugs are fueling and driving and steering the ship on a lot of the decisions being made. So being told that you're going to get paid a little bit of money to go to a party and get drunk and party with some people, or being told that you'll be given drugs or there's free drugs there, will bring people to this Piggy Palace, however undesirable it is. So they start doing some digging on this Pickton. He's got an arrest record. They start checking out the police run-ins with the Piggy Palace, and Detective Schinner becomes convinced that Robert Pickton was a good suspect for at least some of the missing women. So she contacts the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, specifically the officer who had arrested and charged Pickton in a 1997 attack on a sex worker. This is when Pickton had stabbed a sex worker on his farm. So the farm is under Mountie jurisdiction. Nothing had come of this attack, though. Prosecutors eventually refused to press charges because they felt that the victim was not convincing. She was a heroin addict. Detective Schinner pushed for Pickton to be arrested, but only got an agreement to place Pickton under surveillance for 3 days during a period from October 1 to October 10 of 1998. So 3-day period during that period of time. On the RCMP surveillance request form, Pickton's suspected criminal activity offense is listed as information of unknown reliability, reveals that this subject is responsible for the disappearance of female prostitutes in Vancouver, Barnaby, and New Westminster. He apparently brings them to his residence, whereupon they are killed. Unfortunately, Captain, nothing came of this surveillance. RCMP continued to surveil Pickton on and off, observing him driving in slow circles in downtown Port Coquitlam, visiting a rendering facility, and going into a hotel, but nothing criminal was observed during these surveillance periods. Eventually, police became aware that Pickton knew he was under surveillance.
It'd be hard to run surveillance on Pickton because, one, the farmland is large and there's probably a lot of places to hide, and he probably knows these little shortcuts from one building to the next. So if he doesn't want you to know where he's at on that farm, I'm sure he could disappear pretty quickly.
The easy part of the surveillance is you only need to patrol and catch him picking up a sex worker downtown, because that is what the inquest form, the inquiry form is stating. We believe this guy's picking up sex workers downtown, taking them back to the farm, and then they're never seen again. So that's what you're hoping to catch him in the act of, because that, well, not completely, right? I hope that detectives aren't going, well, if she never comes back, we know we got our guy. Just picking up the sex worker would still be a crime, and you're hoping that that would give you the opportunity to investigate and search that large area like you pointed out, because that's what you really need to do, is get your feet on that ground and be looking around to figure out what is going on there when he wasn't surveilled or could not be surveilled, like you're pointing out. In early November of 1998, our good detective gave 2 photos of Pickton to the DISC. This is Deter and Identified Sex Trade Customers, to show to women engaged in the sex trade to see if any could identify him as, quote, a bad date. Okay, so this is a good technique, but it's a little bit flawed, because a bad date, somebody could get that title numerous ways. Some of them just don't pay the sex worker. Some of them rob the sex worker. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for someone that is causing them to disappear and never come back.
But like you said, he had these parties and girls would go out and work the party and then they'd come back.
Yes. They're showing up in droves to some of these parties. And there's Robert Pickton and his brother are not the only 2 being entertained at these parties. In 1999, another source came forward with a gruesome story, this one also about Robert Pickton, which verified much of what had been related to them by the previous tipster. This individual is named Ross Caldwell. The source said he had seen handcuffs in Pickton's bedroom and a special freezer in his barn from which he had served, quote, strange meat, which he believed could have been human. This source also referenced a female friend, Lynn Ellingson, who had regularly accompanied Pickton to the downtown east side to help him pick up women. Apparently, Pickton had more luck getting women to accompany him if he had a female accomplice. He added that Pickton would often wear wigs when he went to the low track area to pick up prostitutes. Now, whether this is because Pickton was balding or in an attempt to disguise his identity, we just don't know. And Caldwell didn't know as well.
Well, you know how somebody works at a pizza shop or some fast food restaurant that they end up kind of stinking, and it's like, it might be kind of a pizza smell, but it's overwhelming. I couldn't imagine what an individual would smell like working on a pig farm all day.
Exactly. Well, the part of this tip too, the most alarming part of this tip, and it has some credibility, and I can explain why, but Caldwell, the tipster, is saying that his female friend, the one that gave him the information, Ellingson, had told him that she walked into Robert Pickton's slaughterhouse, and instead of an animal, she sees a female body hanging from a meat hook. Pickton is there in the slaughterhouse, standing beside it, cutting strips of flesh off of the legs.
Jesus.
The credibility, or what would make this seem to be a credible tip, was that Ellington explained to Caldwell that she, up until this point in her life, did not realize that human fat was yellow in color, and which in fact it is. Pig fat is white. So that gives us a little bit of credibility here. And in the wake of this tip, the Mounties attempted to question Lynn Ellingson twice, the person that provided the information to Caldwell, who eventually went to the police.
Right.
But both times she refused to talk and denied the story about the body in the barn. It turns out,
probably afraid for her life.
Well, I thought that initially as well, but it turns out that she had attempted to blackmail Pickton. So she's going to try to make some money off of what she's seen.
Yeah, if I saw a woman hanging by meat hooks, I don't think I would be trying to blackmail that guy.
She tells the police that when she was on the farm, every time that she was on the farm, she was high on cocaine or some form of narcotic. I guess this is a way for her to explain away what Caldwell is reporting to them. Yeah, I might have told him that, but I was high every time. I was messed up every time I was on that farm. So I'm not saying that they looked the other way, because the RCMP officers did visit Pickton's farm after receiving this information to interview him. This took place on September 1st, 1999. He wasn't home, but when they reached him by phone, he agrees to be interviewed, but it would have to be at night, he says, because he worked constantly during the day. Now, this is where you get angry, right? Like, you're okay, well, your hunch tells you I should investigate this, even though the witness claims to be high all the time while on the farm.
He's a piece of shit.
I don't know how much credibility to give to this claim, and now she's kind of refusing to talk, so I don't have a lot of information here, but they must have had a hunch if they went to the farm. They must have had a hunch if they get him on the phone. He says, yes, I can talk to you in the evening. These detectives say, well, we don't work in the evening.
Yeah, it's absolutely ridiculous. You lazy, fat pieces of shit. Do your job.
It seemed like that was going to be the major speed bump in talking to this individual. Now, David Pickton, the brother, intervened, and the negotiations about the when and where of said interview, he put in his 2 cents saying, you know what, officers, you can come back during the rainy season, because right now we're just too busy working all the time. So for some reason, it appears that the RCMP complied with this request from the Pickton brothers, and this caused a big delay in talking to them. So 4 months later, on January 19th of 2000, RCMP officers finally interviewed Robert Pickton. He denied, of course, any involvement with the missing women, much less killing anyone. What is most shocking is that Pickton did consent to a search of his property at that time, but for reasons that are unknown, the RCMP failed to take him up on this invitation. Robert Pickton stayed under the radar, and women continued to disappear. That's in January of 2000. Another officer interviewed Pickton on his farm in March of 2001, but nothing came of this either. It came out much later that a 911 hang-up call from Pickton's trailer had been received on August 12, 1998, but the responding officer decided that everything appeared fine and concluded that it was simply an error. A second 911 call came in May of 1999 from Pickton's property. Police investigated but saw nothing out of the ordinary.
So question, do you think these 911 calls are coming from victims?
Yeah. I wonder what poor woman, or in both cases, what poor woman had a moment to get her hands on a phone to call for help, only to be cut off, right? The call is cut off and then simply forgotten about.
As law enforcement, you have this suspect, but he's being cooperative. He's saying, I'll talk to you, but it's going to have to be at night because I work. And you would love to get a search warrant, but if the only eyewitness is saying, well, I was on drugs, I was just making shit up, it's probably pretty hard to go to a judge and get a search warrant with those types of claims.
By February of 2000, the Vancouver Police Department and the RCMP continue to focus on their list of persons of interest. So they are looking at it. We can and should critique that investigation along the way, but they're also receiving a lot of criticism and a public uproar for a real investigation to take place about all of these missing women. So it's almost like reaching a crisis point by February of 2000. This is when finally Vancouver Police Department and the Mounties formed a joint task force titled Project Even-Handed. This was to coordinate and facilitate this investigation into the missing women. This was the task force that interviewed Gary Ridgway and the other serial killers that we spoke about. The task force notes indicate that they had some serious suspicions about Robert Pickton. He had been the subject of those 2 tips that we talked about. He had been accused of assault in 1997. He had a known history of violence towards sex workers. He tended to pick up prostitutes in one of his several vehicles and bring them to his property. The list goes on and on and on with this individual, but it seems like, in retrospect, Project Even-Handed continued to largely put Robert Pickton as a great suspect on the back burner.
Well, old Robert Pickton is going to go from the back burner to the front burner.
And unfortunately, and I wish that I wouldn't have to say that this seems to be par for the course for this investigation, but Robert Pickton would eventually be arrested. He will be brought down not because of a missing woman. He was looked at because of an illegal gun purchase, right? They already had all these tips. They had evidence seemingly under their noses, but it was because of an illegal gun purchase. RCMP Constable Nathan Wells was investigating the street drug trade, and he got Pickton's name from this guy named Scott Chubb. Wells then ran Pickton's name through the police computer and found that the Pickton file contained a note to contact Vancouver police. Okay, so they made a note on this guy. If anybody's looking at him for anything at all, contact Vancouver PD. The RCMP obtained a warrant to search his property for an unlicensed firearm, or any unlicensed firearm, not just the one that they were looking for. And arrangements were made to have 2 members of Project Even-Handed Task Force on hand for the search. This was executed in February of 2002. February of 2002. This problem's been going on since the mid-90s, and Pickton was on their radar since at least 1997 from all the information that I've found. RCMP officers and task force members entered the farm and Pickton's trailer. One of the officers noted an asthma inhaler labeled with the name of one of the missing women on the task force list, Serena Abbotsway. Some other items appearing to belong to women on the missing women's list were found as well, this including wallets and clothing. Officers stopped the search immediately, and the next day task force officers obtained their own warrants. Remember, I don't know how things work in Canada, but here in the United States, your warrants need to be quite specific. You don't want this thing to get jammed up and all gummed up in the court system because you were in there collecting things that weren't on your original search warrant. Remember, they're only there looking for illegal firearms, and they're finding evidence of other crimes.
So that search warrant got their hooves in the door, and now they're finding more evidence to connect him because he's the primary suspect in the missing girls cases. So what you're saying is now they have to go back to the judge and say, hey, we're not just looking for illegal firearms, we're also looking for evidence in these other cases.
Yes, missing women and potential murder. So within hours, the Pickton property, the address here is 953 Dominion Avenue, became the site of the largest crime scene search in Canada history. This farm was actually not operational, despite being referred to as a pig farm for ever since I can remember. Much of it was utilized by Mr. Pickton's brother Dave for a topsoil business and as a dump site for waste from his demolition operation. The company's name was DNS Bulldozing. So this property's filled, as you pointed out, Captain, it's a large property. It's filled with older vehicles that were stripped for their parts. These are just kind of strewn about the property. So the property in large resembles a junkyard with roaming animals, garbage, and decrepit structures dotting the landscape.
It's like the Stephen Avery property.
Robert Pickton was, as we said, arrested, but he was originally charged with the weapons offenses. This takes place February 7th, but then he's arrested again later that same month and is charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. This is for the murders of Serena Abbotsway and Mona Wilson. Both names appeared on the missing women's list, and these women disappeared in 2001. Remember, he's on their radar at 1997. By the time Pickton was arrested in 2002, at least another 14 women had been murdered. And by that point, we have 50 women are on that list.
You know, when you're watching a scary movie and you cover your eyes and then you make a little gap in your fingers so you can see what's going on. That's the part of the story I feel we're at. There's a part of me that doesn't want to hear the evidence they found on the farm, and there's another part of me that does want to hear it. So what did law enforcement find on the Pickton farm?
Well, you are right to cover your eyes. But in this situation, you probably should cover your ears. The answer is truly horrifying and beyond words, in my opinion. So during a search of Pickton's trailer, right? We're not talking about the property at large.
Right.
We're talking about his trailer where he lived and slept. They found a loaded .22 revolver with a dildo stretched over the barrel. They found boxes of .357 Magnum handgun ammunition, night vision goggles, 2 pairs of faux fur-lined handcuffs, a syringe with 3 milliliters of blue liquid inside, Spanish fly aphrodisiac, women's clothing and makeup, some of it stained with blood, duct tape, blood stains, 4 more inhalers, all issued to murder victim Serena Abbotsway. In the loft, so we'll go to his workshop. In the loft of a workshop on the property, investigators found a .357 Magnum handgun. So this one's hidden and concealed, unlike the dildo-covered .22 that we talked about. This one I presume to be the illegal firearm that they were looking for, because this is the one that was hidden and concealed. One of the constables who was present for the search tried to describe just how horrified she was at the sights and smells, I guess, coming from this pig farm that's no longer in operation.
Stinky pig.
She described seeing neglected animals on the farm, and I'm not going to go too in detail with that. You can find that information if you want to hop on the old computer machine and do some research. But one part in particular, and this would be the finding of human remains, which obviously makes him, Robert Pickton, prime suspect number 1. So here's a description for you of this find. It's a graphic photo, a picture of the contents of a green garbage can that was found in the slaughterhouse next to Robert Pickton's trailer that he lived in. A brown garbage can had been inserted into the green garbage can. And when the brown one was removed, they found remains of Mona Wilson, again, who disappeared in December of 2001. They're discovered inside. Submerged in a pink soup of decomposing human matter, there were 2 halves of Wilson's skull, along with her hands and feet, and a .22 caliber bullet was found in the can with her remains. In addition to the remains in the garbage can, which belonged to who knew how many women, the heads, hands, and feet of 2 more women were found in large pails in a freezer in Pickton's workshop. Investigators had been drawn to this freezer because of an overpowering smell emanating from it. The women's skulls had been sawed in half, and their hands and feet had been stuffed inside those halves. The flesh was in an advanced stage of decomposition.
What a sicko.
Once these absolutely disgusting and mind-boggling finds were discovered, authorities swarmed the 17-acre property and then conducted the largest search in Canadian history.
Pickton is like if you take Buffalo Bill, Ed Gein, and Dahmer and roll them all into one.
Well, he's got a lot of resources, unfortunately, and it seems like he was able to operate without any detection at all. I mean, yeah, we have some surveillance, we have a couple police visits, but 17 acres, the shock here and the surprise here is he didn't live there alone. His brother lived there with him, and as we talked about, there were all these parties at the Piggy Palace.
Right.
And that's why we sit here and we say, even all these years later, we do not know how many people knew exactly what was going on or had an idea and just chose to either look the other way because of greed, drugs, or what have you. But in the end, Captain, it took 22 months to search this property, and the cost to the Canadian government was $70 million.
Jesus. And how many lives could they have saved?
Immediately and truly about 7 years far too late. However you'd like to look at it, an announcement came from Vancouver Police Department about the developments in the missing women's case. And they announced the arrest of Robert Pickton.
Join us back here in the garage for part 2, and until then,
be good, be kind, and don't litter.
If you're on the lookout for true crime stories told from a fresh perspective with nuance, depth, and detail, I have a new show for you. Check out Murder True Crime Stories, a Crime House original podcast. From the shocking Chandra Levy case and infamous Tylenol murders to the tragic deaths of the Clutter family, each episode focuses on a famous solved or unsolved murder case. Listen in every Tuesday as the show dives into the darkest corners of true crime, unraveling chilling narratives, examining compelling clues, and most importantly, seeking the truth. What sets Murder True Crime Stories apart is the focus on humanizing the victims and the effect their deaths had on their families, friends, and community. We'll always leave with the knowledge of why their stories need to be heard. There's a story behind every murder, but is there an ending? New episodes of Murder True Crime Stories release every Tuesday. Just search for Murder True Crime Stories on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.